Thank you everyone for joining tonight's clinical case webinar on supervised injection for harm reduction. So tonight we have Dr. Marianne Jauncey with us, who's the medical director of MSIC, as well as a lecturer at UNSW and University of Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and recognize continuing connection to land, water, and culture. So these are just the registrations for tonight. We have some of the geographic registrations and then the roles. Thank you to everyone for joining, and it's nice to see someone from each category. And just something about the clinical case webinars. These are monthly webinars that we hold on Tuesday nights on Zoom. They cover different topics, and if you join live, you will get a certificate that you can use for CPD points that we'll mail to you the next day. And these webinars are recorded and available on the OTAC website. So just some quick housekeeping. Please keep yourselves on mute. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to type it in the chat, and we have Dr. Sharon Reed with us who will monitor the chat. Or you can wait until the end of the session to ask Marianne any questions. When you speak, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself. Please remember that the webinars are recorded, so don't reveal any identifying information. And now I'll turn it over to Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess and Sharon. Absolute pleasure to be here. I was just telling people I'm very impressed at people on a Tuesday evening that turn up on time and keen. Amazing. Lovely to be sharing a Tuesday afternoon with you. In some ways, I think the topic today is slightly different in that it's not perhaps so obviously relevant to your everyday lives, given that unfortunately I'm still sitting at the moment in the only supervised injection facility in the state. Obviously, that's something that I hope will change. But I'll try and make it as interesting and relevant. Jump in and ask questions whenever you have them, because that way it'll be most useful for all of us. And thank you, Jess. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm sitting on Gadigal land at the moment, and I think the reality of the First Nations statistics that we see in this country can never be forgotten if you're working in drug and alcohol, when 33% of people in New South Wales prisons, as we're sitting here tonight, identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and obviously the majority are there for drug-related crimes. So it is a stain on this country and something that we are, I think, beholden in this area to do something about. So we'll be going through some stuff about needle syringe programs and supervised injection facilities, also known as drug consumption rooms, what they are, what they do, how they operate, a little bit about overdose, a brief discussion about harm reduction. I just had the privilege of going to the harm reduction conference in Colombia, a little bit about stigma, and we've got some times for questions. Next slide. And this is just basically those expressed in learning objectives, so that you do know about the evidence behind NSPs, supervised injection facilities, what's going on at the moment. Yes, next slide. So I think probably most people have a little bit of a sense that needle syringe programs are the cornerstone of Australia's harm reduction response to the threat of HIV as it emerged in the 80s. And it was Neil Blewett and Peter Baum who were the two Liberal and Labor Minister for Health and Opposition Health spokesperson federally. And I think if you talk to them now, one of the things they would say is we kind of take it for granted that we've got bipartisan support for the introduction of needle syringe programs. I've got a question. If the whole HIV thing revealed itself now in 2025, I don't know about you, but I've got to tell you, I'm not sure we would have a bipartisan response at a federal level and any chance of introducing clean injecting equipment to people who inject drugs, despite the fact that there's no doubt that it's been extraordinarily successful. And I suppose that is worthwhile to remember, because politics plays such a greater degree of influence in our lives as healthcare workers that are involved in drug and alcohol work than probably most other areas of healthcare, which which partly makes it interesting, but sometimes very problematic. So obviously, the provision of clean injecting equipment was a way of protecting us against the threat of HIV. But let's remember that it was not framed as a way of protecting people who inject drugs. It was framed as a way of protecting us, because the idea was that those people, those others, could be vectors of disease and could represent a threat to us, because people we might love might have sex with one of those people, and therefore if we keep them disease free, that's a way to keep us safe. And that notion of we're keeping them free of disease because they are vectors of disease actually still plays out today. And I would argue when we saw COVID, you know, all of my clients suddenly got housed for the first time in decades of their life, and they're not housed anymore. And again, we cared about them when they represented vectors of disease. So we've got a range of needle syringe programs and ways that they're provided in primary services, secondary services and pharmacies, and at least 600 or so physical spots in New South Wales. Quick question to get us all started. Next slide. How many syringes in the whole of Australia do we actually provide, do you think? So this is fully funded by government, states and territories around the country, for the purposes of injecting illegal substances. What do people think the answer is to these? I often ask this on tours. I had a Greens MLC come through today, and I asked her and her staffer, and I don't think I've ever had somebody get particularly close. So if you want to reveal it, Jess. So brilliant. So a third of you got it right. Around Australia, we provide 50 million syringes knowingly to people who inject drugs in this country. And in fact, we're told that we should be doing it more often and providing more of them to prevent more of a spread of hepatitis C. So about 15 million in New South Wales and about 50 million nationally. Next slide. Hopefully you guys know about this. So if you're ever asked by a client, where to find the nearest place to get clean injecting equipment, you can log on to NSP in New South Wales. You can either go to that little thing where you type the suburb or the postcode and it'll tell you the NSP, or you can log on to the map and zoom in and out. Next slide. And in terms of the evidence for HIV, we know that the return on investment figures show that for every dollar we invest, we save at least 4 or 5 in terms of direct healthcare costs averted, because HIV and hepatitis C are very expensive and the provision of a clean needle is very inexpensive, and so we know that we have a positive return on investment. I don't know if people know what the rate of HIV is amongst people who inject drugs in this country, but it's extremely low, probably 1 to 1.5%, which is far lower than the prevalence of HIV amongst men who have sex with men. But it's very different for hepatitis C, and I'm not sure if people know the reason why, which is basically because HIV came in the 80s and we were able to introduce this before it took hold, whereas hepatitis C we didn't actually know about. It was called non-A, non-B back then, and we didn't even have a blood test until about 1990. So in fact, that disease was spreading amongst people who injected drugs, and so the horse had bolted before we introduced NSP, which is why we were much better at preventing the epidemic of HIV, and it's harder to bring an existing epidemic under control. And these are actually well supported by the public, and indeed supervised injecting facilities are well supported by the public. So the next slide actually comes from a letter to the editor, which is just about to be published in Drug and Alcohol Review, which has got the latest data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. So the first thing is you see that it goes over about 23 years, and you look at the green bars. So the green bars is the proportion of the population that support supervised injecting facilities, and you've got to remember these are people that are just rung up out of the blue. Hey, what do you think about? So no other information given, and the green bars have always been the biggest bar, with a possible exception in 2004. But so there's basically always been more support than opposition. The second is to look at the orange bars, and you can see that the trend has definitely been to reduce. So the opposition to supervised injecting facilities has continued to decrease. And you can see, so in the latest data, sort of 21% of people oppose, 58% support. So roughly 3 times as many people support SIFs as oppose them. And the other thing that you can see is that blue bar, relatively speaking, has stayed about the same. And that's the I don't know enough to comment response. And it's kind of important from a public policy point of view. I mean, we take public tours through at MSIC, and we try and say yes to lots of kind of educational opportunities. And, you know, sometimes you feel like, heavens, I must have spoken to everybody in Australia about this place. But clearly we haven't. And there's, you know, basically as many people who oppose us as who don't know. And so when you're talking about the persuadable middle, you know, a lot of those people in the ambivalent camp, we need to be able to contact and provide information to them about it. Next slide. So in terms of a bit of a history about us, I started working in King's Cross in 1998, and in 1999, that was a front page headline in the Sun Herald in January. We give our kids heroin injecting kits instead of help now. The health minister admits it's wrong. The fellow is being, a young lad is being assisted to inject, and it says, you can't see it on that, but that he was allegedly a 12-year-old boy. We now know, shock of shocks, that he was 16 at the time the photograph was taken, and both he and the other fellow were paid by the Sun Herald for the purposes of that front page headline. And at the time, it felt like kind of the worst thing in the world. I provided outreach to a place in Redfern known as The Block, which Sharon will be familiar with. And briefly for a period of time, the provision of clean injecting equipment, the mainstay of our response, was shut down, and we couldn't do it for a period of time. However, it was this headline that ultimately gave us the drug summit, and the drug summit ultimately led to the opening up of my service. Bob Carr said if re-elected, he would hold the first drug summit back in 1999. He was re-elected, and although he was not necessarily supportive, in fact, ultimately one of the recommendations that came out of the drug summit was not that the government would open up an injecting facility, but that they wouldn't stop it, so that they would get out of the way. The other image is a stylized diagram of the blue kind of rectangle is where I'm sitting. That's our service opposite the train station, and what we call the main drag is Darlinghurst Road, and those dots are supposed to represent ambulances attending heroin overdose. There were 677 ambulance call-outs to heroin overdose within a few hundred metres of where I'm sitting right now, and it literally worked out to about an ambulance every 12 hours around the clock. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. So this was very much the epicenter of the sale of drugs, the purchase of drugs, and often the very public use of drugs and subsequent public overdose. Next slide, please. So the question was, we provide clean injecting equipment, but we shrink from providing safer and more sanitary premises for that activity to occur. That was what one of the first government recommendations in the late 1990s said. And of course, we're providing clean injecting equipment and sending people away. And so we're sending them away to these types of scenarios. And again, because we don't really care about their life, we care in so much as they're vectors of disease. And so the basic premise is, would we prefer that we send people away for this? Or, next slide, we take the drug use out of the public spaces and out of the outdoor areas and put it into a health service. Every time I do a tour, it shocks me to think that people find this a hard ask. Would you prefer to live in an environment where people are using drugs in public, possibly discarding their needles and associated paraphernalia in public, injecting in public, and associated activities? Clearly people would prefer that it's in a certain place, and indeed the local community of King's Cross have always supported this service, and it's increased over time because they've seen the direct benefit. So we have very clear public support, but we also have a small number of very loud detractors, which sometimes make the headlines. So this is a picture of stage 2. It's a one-way service. people come in with pre-obtained, pre-purchased drugs. We don't provide the drugs. We're not a heroin prescription trial. They get the clean injecting equipment, which is not unusual. They go to one of these booths and use. Obviously, then we're there in the event of an adverse reaction or overdose. And then from here, they go into the aftercare area before then going out into the back street as a one-way service into Kellett Street. Next slide, please. So there's actually more than probably nearly double that number of peer-reviewed articles now. There's closer to 500 and more than 150 supervised injecting facilities or drug consumption rooms around the world in at least 18 countries. I discovered recently that there's one in Colombia and 2 in Mexico that aren't well known. And the idea is that they both have public amenity aims as well as public health aims. So they decrease the needle splitter and the public injecting. And in Europe, actually, the chambers of commerce were the organisations that were trying to get them up and running because they just didn't want the public drug use. They wanted to clean up the neighbourhood for the businesses, whereas in other areas we've been much more concerned about the public health benefits, which is obviously reducing bloodborne viruses through the provision of clean injecting equipment, increasing contact with people because they're often in pre-contemplative or contemplative. They're not necessarily saying they want to get into treatment or into rehab. They're here to use drugs, so we make contact with more people than would be otherwise seen in other services. And then the primary aim, which is really the decrease in morbidity and mortality associated with drug overdose. So again, we don't prevent the overdose per se, but we prevent the injury and the death that may result from that overdose because we intervene immediately.
Marianne, there's a question in the chat. I just thought I'd interrupt you.
Yeah, please tell me.
Wendy's asking, have there been many adverse reactions, overdoses over the years? So you've spoken about the overdoses, but what's more adverse?
So I've got a slide in a couple which gives you some stats, but it's a good question. So for example, we wrote up something in Drug and Alcohol Review earlier about 2 people that came in thinking they were injecting cocaine and had very distinct distressed reaction to them. One became largely catatonic and was kind of looking but not seeing and pretty much not moving on the floor, couldn't get up, couldn't walk, couldn't respond, was breathing okay, didn't have pinpoint pupils, but just basically. And the other one, so that fellow had an ambulance and was taken off to hospital, and the other fellow, who was actually a very gentle soul, I know him reasonably well, who became completely distressed and couldn't quite tell us what was going on, but was terribly frightened, but also became terribly agitated, picking up yellow bins full of syringes, throwing them across the room, screaming, smashing his head, banging his head against the wall. And we had to call both ambulance and police. And it turns out that it was tyletamine, so a ketamine analogue, and they'd kind of gone into a bit of a K-hole. So we do see both adverse reactions as well as sort of traditional opiate overdoses. We even in the early days had 3 people who became reduced level of responsiveness, and we were trying to work out what was going on, and it turns out they'd injected insulin unwittingly and unknowingly. So the obvious stuff happens, but when you're seeing as many injections as we do, the unexpected stuff happens as well. Next slide. So this is just a reminder that this is a totally legal service. So we do have decriminalisation in New South Wales. It's just that it's limited to my building. So in the building where I work, it is no longer a crime to be in possession of a small quantity of drugs for personal use. It is no longer a crime to self-administer. There's no specification in the legislation about they have to inject. We're not able to allow smoking on site because of the WHS risks associated with secondhand smoke. So we would need to install special extractor fans, which are actually really expensive. But we technically could do that. The law wouldn't make a distinction. It's not legal to share or deal or sell in any way. And the other clarifications are that you have to be 18 years of age or older. You have to have injected before. You can't be intoxicated or accompanied by a child. And Uniting, which is the mothership, where you can see Uniting down the bottom, which is the services and advocacy arm of the Uniting Church, have the licence to operate the service. So the legislation allows for a licence to be granted to a single organisation and for a single service to operate in the country. Next slide. So We literally had our birthday the other week, and these are a few stats. So you can see lots and lots of people have registered with the service, but in any particular year, we make contact with about 2,000 different individuals, more than 1.3 million injections. And at the moment, our average is actually not particularly busy, about an average of 100 a day, more like 120 maybe during a week, and 80 or 90 on a weekend or a public holiday. There's been nearly 12,000 cases of us intervening for an overdose without obviously morbidity or mortality, because if you are present, nobody ever needs to die of an opiate overdose. If you know what to do and you have the resources to intervene, you can and will save people. It's also about making referrals into other services and care. We also provide take-home naloxone, also apply nicotine replacement therapy. What's the drug that's actually most likely to kill our clients continues to be cigarettes. We've had 10 years this year of our consumer action group working, a lot of case coordination, crisis intervention, and also Uniting has done a lot of advocacy work. They now run what's called a fair treatment campaign, and as far as I'm aware, they're the first faith-based organisation that's been campaigning for the decriminalisation of substances in New South Wales, which is kind of interesting. Next slide, please. So what do we do? Overdoses look very different to each other. There's a range, and probably that's not a surprise to you, but obviously you get the people that stand up, look a bit wobbly and literally fall on the floor, start to turn blue very quickly, have no respiratory effort and are unresponsive. But you also get people that just get a bit drowsy and groggy, people that act a bit weird or unusual. So often people make funny noises, or can start doing silly things, shaking their chest or calling out for mummy. And, one of the best things that we've got is an oxygen saturation monitor that we can pop on someone's finger. And if they've got signs and symptoms of an overdose and SATs that are starting to go down, we will just intervene with oxygen, and that's mostly what we do. Oxygen either via a Hudson mask or, if necessary, bag valve mask resus if somebody isn't breathing. And obviously we have the capacity to give naloxone. We normally give an intramuscular injection, but we've got Nixoid if need be. But in fact, we don't do that on most of our overdoses. Most of the time, opening up their airway, reminding them to breathe, giving them some supplemental oxygen is enough. And we probably intervene more often than you might think. And that's not because every 80 heroin injections would necessarily result in death, but I don't apologise for the fact that I'm going to give someone a little bit of supplemental oxygen if they'll accept it, because why would you have somebody sit there with SATs that drop from 90 to 87 to 84 to high 70s if you don't need to, so. You can also see that depending on what people are injecting, the rate of their saturations decreasing and the level of consciousness decreasing is also really quite different. Next slide. So this is what an overdose looks like. This is actually a real overdose that happened, and we had a photographer from the UK that is very skilled at managing to get photographs that protect the identity of the individual. So obviously we recognise those pants and those shoes, but hopefully other people don't. And although you can't see other clients, the other thing to notice is that it's a real teachable moment, because other people in that space also see their friend or their colleague go down, and it's an opportunity for us to remind everybody else in the room that overdose is an ever-present risk, and that everybody needs to know how to respond and how to use Narcan. Next slide. And that's why we often remind people about naloxone and get you on naloxone here. Next slide. So people are often really interested about what drugs are used at our service. And this is data up until literally 13 days ago, until the end of April. So the top line is the total number of visits every month. And you can see that it's, been as high as nearly 8,000. And at the moment, it's more like about 3,000. You can see in the very early days of the grey line, we actually had more cocaine than anything else, and that has not been repeated because cocaine is extraordinarily expensive in Sydney. And then we had it mostly heroin, which is the red line. And then in the mid-2000s, we had the emergence of this kind of brown line, which was prescription opioids, combination of morphine and oxycodone. for 3-4 years, and then that kind of seemed to take off. And rather than it being a 50-50 split, we mostly had oxycodone, and 80 milligram Oxycontin tablets were the currency in King's Cross, up until 2014. If people remember what happened back then, was the reformulation of Oxycontin tablets. And so rather than just scraping off the waxy coating and then crushing it and adding water, if you crushed it and added water, it just became this paste. So literally overnight, all of the pharmacies removed the old stock, the OCs, and we had the OPs. And so we had a very dramatic week at MSIC. And you can see it took a bit of time, but the red line then appeared, and then we went back to it being mostly heroin. And then you can see, obviously, in early 2020, another precipitous drop, which we all know what happened in the world in 2020. And you can see both the green line, which is amphetamines as well as heroin, dropped, but the green line, relatively speaking, has sort of come back a bit more. It dropped when there was lockdowns, and so we're not quite back at pre-COVID numbers. But the other interesting thing that happened over since COVID was that actually we found more amphetamines being used than heroin. At the moment, it's roughly 50-50, but we've always been opiates. Whether it was heroin or Oxycontin or morphine, we've always been largely opiates. And so in the last few years, we've actually seen more amphetamine injection. And that green line used to be powdered speed. It's all now crystal methamphetamine that's being used. I think I saw a question, but it's disappeared. So you might tell me, Sharon.
There's a question, yeah. Are you finding greater incidence of overdoses with the combinations of the synthetic drugs from overseas? For example, the nitazines, bromazine, caffeine, methamphetamines?
Simple answer, no. So we used to have small numbers of fentanyl being injected, and that was actually prescription fentanyl. So largely people coming in with the patches, cutting them up, putting them on a spoon, adding water, a bit of citric, heating them and trying to get the fentanyl out of the patches. We don't see that as commonly as we did a few years ago. We've had a couple of cases where we've seen illicitly manufactured fentanyl appearing in, say, heroin, but it's been pretty sporadic around Australia, and certainly, not that common here. To the best of our knowledge, we've not seen any nitazines to date at MSIC. But I guess whoever asked that is probably highlighting the fact that we do have a more contaminated drug supply, not only in New South Wales, but around Australia than we've ever had. And I think we do need to be concerned about the threat posed by synthetic super potent opioids like fentanyl drug classes or nitazine drug classes. They're easier to manufacture. They're not reliant on trying to get the drug out of Afghanistan or somewhere in Southeast Asia, and they're easier to import because you need smaller quantities. So I think we are right to be concerned about the potential threat that they pose. We have tested to... Yeah, so we also have the capacity to do on-site dipstick testing. The trick to remember with these dipstick is everybody thinks that 2 stripes is a yes, 2 stripes is a no. So it's the opposite to what you'd expect. It's the opposite to pregnancy, and it's the opposite to COVID. We also, at the moment, have a fancy paper spray mass spectrometer on site. We're still trying to get the machine to work, which is a ministry-funded kind of surveillance program, which is looking to try and contribute to the data that we have about New South Wales and what's circulating. But I have to say, in the government's wisdom at the moment, we have one of the best machines available to us, and yet would not yet be able to test somebody's drugs pre-use, technically would only be able to test their drugs post-use. I'll leave that to you as to whether or not that makes sense. A significant proportion of our new clients identify as First Nations, and a quarter of our visits are by somebody who identifies. That's an underestimate because some people haven't officially told us at registration. A significant proportion of our people have unstable housing, including sleeping rough. Gradually getting older, still mostly men, and long-term injecting drug users. So that's the end of the stuff about MSIC, and I just wanted to have a couple of questions about some of the stuff that I found really interesting and learnt, because I've had to do, next slide is fine, had to do media, and what I've learned is that sometimes the way we talk about drugs, we're sort of doing the opposition's work for us. Next slide. So this was a piece of work that Uniting and the Australian Drug Foundation funded for an external organisation to go out and do some research and do some testing on a sample of people about what kind of messages work, and depending on whether you were already in the group of people that support, or you were in the persuadable middle, as we call them, or you were in the people that actively, are happy that stigma and think that stigma is a good thing. And they found some really interesting stuff. Next slide. They've given us kind of a top tips. And next slide, I've just highlighted a few of them. And so one of the things they said is that so often when we're talking about drugs and people who use drugs, we reinforce the negative. So we say people who use drugs shouldn't be considered to be criminals. The presumption is that they're violent, and that's not true. There is drug use isn't associated with violence, and we should decriminalise it, because the shame and the stigma don't help people. It leads to marginalisation and discrimination, and these are terrible things, and they shouldn't happen. And what have we just done? We've just used the words shame and stigma and negative, and violence and criminal, and we really need to be finding new ways to talk about that, and reframing and talking about the world as we want it to be, and using positive language. So I've got an example just, and before we go to the next slide, you also about framing by values and using personal stories. So talking about wanting an honest and an open conversation, and finding that shared ground, because I think all of us want an honest and open, the capacity for our kids to have honest and open conversations, and all of us want a society where people are kept safe. But I feel there's a lot of work for us to do to get a bit better at this, and this is freely available, this document, or I can send it to people. Next slide. So just out of interest, this was a quote from the Premier that he made at the drug summit, where he stood up in front of all of the delegates and said, "Addiction is an awful thing, but people who suffer shouldn't be exiled from our community, because life is littered with people who've confronted their demons and turned their lives around. The age of shame must end, because shame never helped anyone. We should be celebrating those people who have conquered this terrible affliction." Now, in many ways, you could say he's trying to say some good things, but I got to tell you, the people with lived experience in the room did not a lot of what Chris Minns had to say. And so this is not exactly, a direct quote, but, next slide. So you can see, if you look at the words, there's awful, there's suffer, there's exile, there's litter, there's demons, there's shame twice, there's conquer, there's terrible and affliction. There's one nice word, which is the green celebrating. So that is such a great example of reinforcing the negatives. Next slide. So this is an example that, we're trying to get better at within Uniting and MSIC, about wanting to live in a society where people can have open and honest conversations about drugs, because we all know somebody who uses drugs, and maybe a family who's been affected. More than anything, we want to keep the people that we love safe. And the best way to do that is to make sure they feel safe when they're asking for help, and also to make sure that help is always available to those who need it. And again, next slide, you can see that the words that are there are things like honest, open, love, safe, care, and help. And it really makes a difference. I'm finding it quite hard to do, so I'll kind of be interested if you guys have got feedback. But I do think we need to get much better at really shifting. Stop talking about the war on drugs, and the war on drugs has failed because it's a war on people. All everybody hears from that word is war. Let's start talking about gentle, kind, accepting societies where people who need help can get it, and we can have open and honest conversations. Next slide. I'm not sure if people knew about this, but we managed to get this out just before the Drug Summit, which was an updated position statement from the College of Physicians, which a lot of people worked very hard to get finalised in time and approved. And next slide. one of the things in here is that as physician, our perspective on drug use derives from the fact that drug use is actually quite common, but most of it is episodic. Most of it actually doesn't cause harm. That drug use can cause harm, but importantly, policy and our response can also cause harm. And as a society, we should seek to reduce harms to the greatest possible extent through a range of approaches. Obviously, harm reduction is just one of those, and that we need to recognise that drug use exists on a spectrum. And in fact, again, most people's drug use is low level and occasional, and most people who use drugs don't suffer harm. Obviously, we as physicians tend to see the ones that are at the other end of the spectrum. Next slide. Just out of interest, I was really lucky enough to be able to go to the latest harm reduction conference, which is in Colombia, and it was fascinating to see discussions about drug policy from a source country. So not just the harms from the individuals, but the deforestation and the impact of aerial spraying and poisoning, so that coca can't grow, but neither can coffee or any other crop. And so the information from Colombia was, we don't need to just decriminalise use, you need to decriminalise aspects of production, manufacture and selling, i.e. trafficking, because of the human rights abuses that are being done in the production and sale of these drugs. And they were really saying, we've got to, decriminalisation is yesterday's argument. We need to start thinking about how we have safe and appropriate mechanisms of regulated supply without putting the profits in the hands of big business. We don't want the market to respond. So what are the mechanisms in society that we have for a social kind of organisation where you can reinvest the profits, say, into health and education? Obviously talked about the intersectionality that the so-called drug war that we're not allowed to talk about is involved in race, in poverty, in capitalism, in colonialism, in gender. And yes, 3 DCRs or drug consumption rooms in Latin America that I didn't know about. Next slide. These were just a couple of kind of interesting kind of quotes and ideas. Harm reduction as radical tenderness and a shared recognition of humanity. I've often sort of said that, sometimes our marginalised clients have no voice. It's not that, it's that others refuse to listen. Dignity is not a privilege. And that there is a collective silence from people like us who inherit power and allow the status quo to remain, and that we need to understand within this collective unconscious lives our own unconscious bias. A number of people saying there's no such thing as fair trade cocaine and saying that they were going to think twice. Stigma is a social determinant of health. I saw a wonderful T-shirt that just said, say perhaps to drugs. And the future is not yet written and we are not powerless. All right, let's go into a couple of case studies out of interest. You have a new client who has quite a large heroin habit. You're starting them on methadone and you're starting them on 40 milligrams, but you know that they're not going to be fully held. So they're going to still have some opiate withdrawal if they use only their methadone in those early days. What is your approach, and who brings up the idea of them continuing to use, and if so, what do you say? So I think this is an option for a poll, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive questions, and I've also, for all of the polls, got something else, because there might be something else that you want to tell us. But do you kind of keep quiet about them using and wait till they ask questions? Do you acknowledge that they'll have some withdrawal but really just try and emphasise that things will keep getting better? Do you tell them about the risk of overdose and tell them about MSIC or something else? It's interesting because I don't know about your experience, but I often find that people forget about OST as an overdose prevention technique. You can reduce someone's overdose risk amazingly by putting someone on OST. Yeah, so most people are saying that they do talk to them about overdose risk, and so nobody doesn't bring it up. So I think that's fabulous. All right, next slide. So you start them on 40, they may be using a bit and you've told them about things. You see them, they're referred back to you because they have some cellulitis near their injecting site. You see that they're clearly in withdrawal, they're upset, and they say to you that they've got heroin in their pocket and you're with them alone in the room. They're distressed because they're saying that nobody cares and they've got no one to be with them. They know that you gave them naloxone and they said, and who am I going to give it to? Because I don't have anyone that cares at the moment. But they want to use with you. And they say, you've just told me that if somebody is present, I don't need to die. I'm having a shit time, but I don't want to die. Could I just use here with you, doc? Could I just, or nurse or whoever, social worker, caseworker, whoever you are, you lovely healthcare worker, could you just let me use in front of you? Don't need to tell anybody, but you've just told me that you can keep me alive. What do you do? Next poll. Do you try to be kind, but leave it at that? Do you try and distract them and get them onto a different topic? Do you ask them where they're going to use and then either you or someone else from your clinic try and do a walk by and check, are they in the public toilets of the nearby library or shopping centre or public hospital or KFC? Do you unofficially suggest that there's a public toilet somewhere nearby that they could use? Do you give them naloxone knowing that they can't use it on themselves? Do you let them use in their room, i.e. something else? I had a nurse come through on a tour the other day and she was talking about this and she said that they have a public toilet in their space. And she said, I know they use it. I've never felt okay about quite kind of acknowledging it. But she said, I know we treat overdoses in the toilet all of the time. And she really struggled with this. And in fact, interestingly, she did what the common answer is here, is actually ask them where they're going to go and then see if somebody can go by. I've done that myself. And I've actually visited a service in the States before their first supervised injection facilities opened. There was a harm reduction service that provided the clean syringes. They had a toilet and they had a specific written toilet policy. And they had somebody who sat outside the toilet and they had a timer. And every 5 minutes they knocked on the toilet. And if you went into the toilet itself was not functional. There was a stainless steel bench in the toilet. It was clearly the supervised injecting room, but nobody could call it that because it couldn't be official. And so they had all of this stuff around it, which again, you just think, out of interest, did anybody want to say what their something else was? Did they come off mute? You don't have to, I won't make you, but.
Hey, sorry, Marianne, Wendy here. My suggestion was going to be increase the methadone dose on that day as a first starter.
Yeah, great suggestion, Wendy. Great suggestion. All right, next slide. So they thank you for your kindness, but say, thanks for the offer of naloxone and the distraction and the extra methadone, but I'm off to use heroin, and they leave. And 15 minutes later, you hear a yell from someone in your clinic down the hallway because the toilet door has been locked for some time and they've just noticed and they're banging on the door and nobody's answering. So next scenario, what do you do in this? You open up the door and you see somebody is blue and seemingly unconscious with their legs wrapped around the toilet, a belt around their arm. Do you immediately call an ambulance because they're trained to deal with this and there's a potentially an uncapped syringe there and you need to make sure that people don't get injured? Do you call for someone to bring oxygen if you've got it and naloxone and try and get something in as quickly as possible? Do you try and excavate him looking for the uncapped needles and calling his name? Do you start CPR on the basis of an unconscious person? First aid training would dictate that, or something else? I'd be interested to know how often you guys within your services have had to deal with an overdose in the clinic, because I mean, it wasn't common, but we certainly dealt with it on more than a handful of occasions in the years that I worked at the Kirkton Road Centre before the injecting centre had opened. So again, there's no specific right or wrong. You're saying ideally oxygen and naloxone have to be your primary focus, because you're making a presumption that he's had an opiate overdose, which is going to be right. Try and extricate him. I mean, hopefully you're going to be doing that as well. So you need to get him out in order to be able to give him the oxygen and naloxone. And obviously, you know, danger response A, B, C. So you are going to try and make sure that there isn't danger to people by trying to find that uncapped syringe, but pulling him out. In terms of starting CPR, if somebody is unconscious in a public place, and the most likely cause of their unconsciousness is likely to be cardiac in origin, and that's where first aid principles would absolutely say start CPR. But I think if you're in a healthcare clinic and you're providing NSP knowingly to people who, a large proportion of which have used heroin, I mean, we have never done CPR at MSIC, because of course the way people die is not through, well, what happens upon opiate overdose is not that their heart stops, but their respiration stops. Now, their heart ultimately will stop if you do nothing and their heart dies because you've not repaired the respiratory arrest, but it's a respiratory arrest that is causing the harm that you need to try and ideally respond, you know, either through oxygenation, bagging, EAR, and ultimately through naloxone. All right, next slide. I'm very grateful to report that he, after a couple of minutes, sort of rubbed his nose and woke up and said, "Oh, what happened? I was just sleepy," which is the standard response that we get from people here after we've given them Narcan. I didn't have an overdose, I was just tired. He doesn't agree to go with ambulance again, which is a common scenario, but leaves without obviously injury, and you've been debriefing with your staff. Is there anything else you would do? Now, this is not a multiple choice answer, just for you to have a bit of a think about. And also for me to tell you that the first time that I dealt with this exact scenario in the clinic where I used to work at the Curtin Road Centre in 1998 when I'd started working there, I am not proud at all to say the other thing that I did was to put a handwritten sign on the toilet door that said closed until further notice because of public injecting. I did that probably because I was really frightened. I had never, we didn't even have oxygen. We just had Narcan, so we just had to wait for someone to start breathing. And he was navy blue, and I thought that we had a dead person who was revived and was fine. And so I'd like to think it was a combination of being really scared and being very naive. But it was one of the exceedingly wise nurses who came up to me on that day and gently said to me, acknowledging that I was frightened, and sort of said to me, "I noticed that you put a sign on the door, Marianne, and you were the one that provided him with the clean injecting equipment. Can I just ask you this?" And then she leant in and asked me a question that in many ways has changed the fundamental course of my life. She said, "Marianne, where did you think he'd go?" Because every day in this country, every year we're giving out 50 million syringes, and I don't think we're asking ourselves the question, where do we think they'd go? Because if we did ask ourselves that question, we would understand that we have absolutely failed in our duty of care to think about people who inject drugs as only vectors of disease worthy of preventing an HIV or an hepatitis C case, and not worthy of preventing them dying from overdose. And that is absolutely not okay. Next slide. So the next case study is a bit more about the way we talk about things in the dying minutes. You're at a dinner party talking about drug policy, and you start saying something in support of decriminalising drugs. And your partner's guest says, "What? You lot are so naive. That's a stupid thing to say. If you decriminalise drugs, it just means more people will take them. What a ridiculous thing to suggest." How do you respond? Do you maybe want to raise your voice, tell him that he shouldn't try and tell you his business and you won't tell him his? Do you internally roll your eyes but try to explain that perhaps he's the one that's naive and you need to take him through the evidence about why the current drug laws cause harm? are you curious and ask him, oh, it's interesting. Tell me more. Why do you think about that? What's your experience? Do you gently talk to him about alcohol and say, well, alcohol is another drug? And does he feel the same way about it or something else? I will admit that I said, raise your voice and tell him to get out of your business, because sometimes I just have to tell you that's what I feel like doing. So yeah, the evidence would tell us that as much as possible, if we can try and suspend judgment with all of those skills that we've learned as clinicians with our clients, if we can try and suspend judgment and be curious and lean in and try and find some common ground, and try and hear from somebody else and let them feel that they can say some things, is the best way to try and ultimately make a difference. Next slide. What about if this conversation had happened online and you can see, you know, there's lots of other people getting involved and it's quite a sort of a heated kind of discussion? Do you just go, oh God, I'm ignoring that, there's no point? Do you think, well, you know what, this stuff shouldn't go unchallenged and I'm going to get in there and I'm going to say my bit? Or do you just go in and just do a little something and then get out? Or something else? Yeah, so you're all right. The evidence would suggest that ideally the best thing is to say something. And the reason for that is for the other people going through and reading that, even if they're not the ones commenting, if they can at least see that there is an alternative point of view. So if you can use some, you know, I statements and some, you know, little bit of personal stories about, you know, why you maybe think differently, you know, that's interesting. You know, I've worked in this space, or I have a brother, sister, friend, whatever, who's used drugs. And in fact, my experience is, you know, that trying to connect with them and help understand is really the best option. At the end of the day, I love my sister, even if I don't agree with everything that she's done. And while I understand that this is not an easy situation, I do think that the best thing we can do is care about other humans and provide help and support and treatment when they need it. And then you can leave it at that. And the evidence shows that at least for somebody reading, scrolling through, they go, oh, okay, so there are other people that think differently, and at least plant a seed. All right, last couple of slides. So probably obvious to say, generally not helpful to lose your temper unless it's for your own personal, you know, well-being, because sometimes you just want to have a bit of a yell. Sometimes a short response is all that's needed. I think we've got to get better at being able to agree to disagree, and find some common ground, even if you know, it's as simple as we all want the people we love to be kept safe, and acknowledge that there's no easy answers or quick fixes. So I just saw a question, any chance MSIC will be extended to regional areas? So what we are trying to convince the government, and was mentioned in the co-chair's report, is to remove what's called 36A. So the part of the legislation that allows us to operate says there will only be one licence and it will only operate at one location. If we can frame that as that's a little bit of the old legislation left from when we were a trial, we just need to get rid of that without talking about where or a location, and saying to government, you still have the right to say no. So we've tried at least 4 times to get another supervised injection facility, and it's crashed and burned and been wholly unsuccessful. So we need to make it a 2-step process to not scare the government, and say, let's allow people the option to apply. Maybe nobody will apply. Who knows where? But let's allow them the option to apply. So a bit like originally, you're not opening an injecting centre, but you're getting out of the way. And then if we can get that change in legislation through, then the idea, rather than one particular spot or even 2, we would have a minimum of 3 services around the state that at a relatively similar time period would go up and say, hey, we're interested in running something, and the idea would be that we use the infrastructure of needle syringe programs that have a small on-site space. We do not need large purpose-built facilities like my one in King's Cross, because we don't have that concentrated epidemic. Drug use is very much more spread out, and so we need a network of smaller services. So I genuinely hope before I die or retire that we will see the capacity for more supervised consumption spaces in New South Wales. Yes, I'm probably not going to happen quite as soon as I might like, but we'll see. So I'm aware of time, so next slide is very quick, just to remind people that sometimes the people that really, really hate us in the strongly opposed are maybe not worth our time. To make change, you really have to find the persuadable middle, which is the people that haven't really firmly made up their mind, and that's probably where it's the most benefit is spent. Next slide. Just to remind us that there's actually a whole bunch of stuff as individuals, let alone organisations, that we can do. Never forget the impact of ringing and writing or meeting with your MP, because that gives them the personal story to tell and to make it real for their constituents and in Parliament. And last slide. This is just from me. This is a photo that I have sitting on my windowsill above my desk, which says, as you can see, until such time as decision makers hear the voices of the vulnerable, advocacy with all its risks remains the responsibility of all physicians. And I have that there to remind me, because sometimes in academia I have to say there's a sense that advocacy is a dirty word, and that, you know, advocacy is not what academics do because we're impartial and we just provide the evidence. But everything happens in a political context, and it's not right to know what will make a difference to our clients and then not use that information to make the world a slightly better place. You're on mute, Sharon.
There's one more question there from Lee. Wouldn't it be wonderful to get an NSP in prisons? Do you ever lobby the decision makers on behalf of people in prison?
Well, yes, and I think that's even possibly further away than getting decriminalisation in this state. The power of the unions in prisons is extraordinary, and as I'm sure you all know, the story of the prison guard who seroconverted to HIV is still to this day used as the justification for why anything else would be considered extremely dangerous. Of course, the reality was that he got that needle stick under the current situation. So why would you defend the current situation given that was what was the cause of the needle stick is beyond me. I agree with you. We've got there's a lot of blue sky dreaming that we could do.
I would just like to say thank you again for presenting today. It's very good information and good for everyone to know, not just doctors. And we have our next clinical case webinar on the 17th of June about music festival, harm reduction, and drug checking in New South Wales.
And thank you very much, Marianne, on behalf of myself and the chat. Everyone thinks it was very great.
My absolute pleasure.
Great prezzo.
Absolute pleasure. If you ever want to send any of your staff, you can book in public tours on our website. And if the dates don't suit, reach out to me and I can find an alternative for you.